I pushed the button. Welcome to Prelude to Ulysses, where Alex reads Norman Mailer's Ancient Evenings. It's been a minute since I read this one. It's getting pretty wild. They made it to the Pharaoh's place. Menenhedet II is still reliving some pretty wacky memories. And now he is with his mom, dad, grandfather, great-grandfather, and they've made it to the Pharaoh's palace. 3. The longest courtyard I have ever seen was before us. If a grown man took a stone and hurled it as far as he could, picked up this stone and hurled it again, he would not have reached the middle. Nor was it a handsome place. There were no pools nor statues, and the road of paved stones down the middle by which the sedan chair carriers brought us was no wider than would be needed for 4 chariots abreast. On either side, an open red clay square stretched to the walls, and I remember my mother speaking of how the Pharaoh paraded thousands of troops on this hot ground. Then, even as I looked across the space, a portal opened in a low barracks at the other end of the courtyard. In the company of Sherdens, Sherdens, I'm not going to look that up. Most of the things I try to look up from this book in the dictionary are just not real words. So Sherdens, let's assume some warrior cast of bodyguards for the Pharaoh. In heavy blue capes, marched out to practice maneuvers. Maybe I was right. In the other corner of the courtyard were armories and storehouses and sentry boxes, and even a huge cauldron of soup on a great fire. The smell of its broth passing to us across the clay. As if Menenhedet's entrance had stirred activity, I could see targets of straw being set up against the wall to the side of the barracks, and archers were flexing their bows. A troop of chariots began to form and reform their lines. From 4 files of 7, they would elongate into 2 files of 14, then wheeling, shift into 2 ranks of 14, then extend into one long and near to perfect line of 28 chariots galloping on the then extended into one long and near to perfect line of 28 chariots galloping on the instant across the field. No wheel ever more than a few fingers ahead of the other. On a sharp cry, they came to a sudden stop, dust rolling off like a wave toward the river wall, and it may have been fortunate for their captain that the cloud did not come near us, since Hathfertiti turned with annoyance in her chair, and said to my great-grandfather, "Promise we do not stay here watching them." He shrugged, but I saw his eye reach to the captain of those charioteers across the distance of the parade ground. In response, that man raised both his forearms in salute and came galloping towards us, the soldier by his side trying to maneuver his leather shield against imaginary arrows. A set of gestures that took up all his balance, while the captain of the charioteers, having wrapped his reins around his waist, was now turning to the horses to left or right by leaning from side to side, pressing backward. He would slow them, coming forward. He let them gallop, swaying his body to make the horses wheel, stop, turn, or charge. And if one could not foretell what his next maneuver would be, all were nonetheless smooth. Meanwhile, his arms free, he unsheathed his bow and put an arrow in it. When the captain swept around us in a flourish, that gave my father a stir. "Fool," he shouted, to which Hathfertiti gave a chill laugh. "I think he's charming," she said. "If the horse tripped, he could send the arrows in our direction," said my father. The captain, having circled away from us, returned in a leisurely trot, came to a halt, leaped out of his vehicle, and touched his forehead to the dust. He and Menenhedet began to speak to each other in a strange language. Strange as the language of the Shurdans, I soon guessed. And after a minute or two, with a last phrase in Egyptian, "As you say, General," the soldier raised his arm in salute, smiled at all of us, at my mother most particularly, remounted, and walked off slowly with his horse in order not to raise the dust. I told him I'd watch maneuvers later, said my great-grandfather. Thank you, said Hathfertiti. Now we came to a smaller gate. A sentry let us through without a word. We had reached another courtyard. It is splendid how they use their reins, said Hathfertiti. But it is our grandfather who developed this style, said my father. Not really, she exclaimed. Our grandfather? Oh no, I didn't know they were related too. Not really, she exclaimed. Certainly, said Menenhedet, in the years before the Battle of Kadesh. That is why we triumphed on that day. He said this with such pleasure that my mother could not resist saying, I thought Ramses II was the victor at Kadesh, not your charioteers. The pharaoh always wins the battle, said Menenhedet. We were passing through another courtyard, immense perhaps as the first, but I did not know how large, since it was divided by walls of trees into more than a few courts and enclosures. Wading pools were surrounded by gardens. To our left was a brightly painted wooden building, and I could see women pass from time to time along its covered balcony on the second story, while a murmur of curious laughter came back to us from the site of Hathfertiti. From their site of Hathfertiti. We were carried now to a white wooden wall on which were painted enormous portraits of a hawk, a scorpion, a bee, a lotus, and a papyrus plant. All so lifelike that I was afraid to pass through. Indeed, I trembled at the nearness of the scorpion. We dismounted from the sedan chairs, and the bearers, after a nod from Menenhedet, gave a quick kiss to the seat, whose leather was marked with nothing less than the hieroglyph. Let's see if I can make you see that. You see that? It's like a little wagon wheel. Which represents the land of the dead. It's like a pizza cut into five slices. Excuse me. Which represents the land of the dead. My father, having handed the Seder Chan leader a copper utnu, UTNU, and the officer at the door having recognized us, I could see by the look of relief on his face that he had been expecting this distinguished guest for half the morning. We passed with many a bow by the attendants into the green and verdant garden of the Pharaoh's court of honor. There, trees with fruit I had never seen before grew at the edge of an oblong pool, whose tiles were covered with gold. When these trees were young, my mother whispered to me, their feet were set in pots, and they were put on boats and carried across many a storm until they reached our land. How does it look, I asked, where the river comes to the open waters? There are more birds, she said, than you have ever seen. I was thinking of the squalling of those birds above the wet land, and how different they must be from the birds of this garden. Here, one flamingo had colors orange and pink and gold, and there was a black ibis, and plovers that raced from branch to branch, showing feathers as brilliant as the tail of an ostrich. I remember when I was 2, and still new to the thought of expressing myself, I had asked my mother why we put the heads of birds on so many of our gods. Having seen, long before I could read, how many of the sacred sticks our scribes drew on papyrus were of birds, I had assumed such hieroglyphs were given to us by the gods as pictures of themselves. My mother had smiled then. The child asks questions that bring peace to my mind, she said. I feel the feathers when he speaks. That was a reference to Mott. I would understand only later. We had a saying that the edge of a feather was the closest you could come to touching the truth. Then, out of whatever composure my thoughts had given her, my mother said, birds are the most respected. They fly. Fly they did. And in this grove they whipped and laced from branch to branch, and seemed to dart in delight at the reflection of themselves in the gold tile of the pool, where their colors flew along the shallow bottom like rainbow-colored fish. Yet even as their gaiety that rollicked through the shade of these foreign trees, I could hear the distant echo of panic. The sounds of these birds were stranger to me than the grunts of animals hard at work, for in those at least I could hear the sounds of the earth. I suppose I mean to speak of that unheard sound that connects one's feet to the earth. Birds, however, always twittered of some unrest that was in the agitation of their flesh forever fearful of our ground. No, the earth was not a place where a bird could rest. Interesting. Pause it for a second. Okay. Nonetheless, this garden, after the glare of the courtyard, was a grove. Was a was a grove. Every smell of loam, Loam, I'm not gonna look it up. It's not one of those days. And some I never smelt before was in my nose, damp and mysterious as the cool I once discovered at the edge of a cave. And in this air, I felt the nearness of the Pharaoh. At the end of our walk, near to obscured by the foliage, was a small wooden villa, painted in every bright color of the flowers of the garden. A peculiar building, on stilts perhaps, yet like a house, built around on all four sides of a patio. Built around all four sides of a patio, so that walking beneath we passed into a deep shadow, and then came out of the shadow to a place in the open center where the sun was shining. I had always dreamed that the Pharaoh would rest on a throne at the end of a great hall, and visitors would approach by crawling forward on their knees, and indeed Menenhedet had told us how Ramses II used to give vast audiences at festival times in the middle of an immense place in the old city of Thebes. But then, even as I was trying to think of how large that could have been, was it larger than where we had seen the charioteers at their drill? We entered the patio, and I felt the Pharaoh, or certainly felt his force, as the sun blinded my eyes on our sudden emergence into its glare. A weight came down upon the back of my head. I'm not reading too great today. A weight came down on the back of my head, heavy as the sun. And before I knew it, had me prostrating myself on the ground in the way I'd been instructed, my hips in the air, my knees and face to the earth. There was a smell of incense to this sacred earth. Was there a smell of incense to this sacred earth? And had no idea whether it was a force from the Pharaoh on the balcony above that had laid me low, or only the hand of my father kneeling next to me on the one side, and my mother on the other. In front of us, honored by his rank, Menenhedet had merely lowered himself to one knee. In a moment, my mother and father rose with Menenhedet, their knees still to the ground, their arms extended, a position natural to my father. I could feel his happiness. Their knees still to the ground, their arms extended. His dad just likes doing that, I guess. That's cool. And demeaning to my mother, I could sense how she detested it. But I, to my surprise, did not wish to move, as if with my mouth and nose pressed to the grit of the dirt, and my eyes not a finger's width above, I felt the heavy peace of that great circle in which we revolve before we sleep. Not daring to look up at the Pharaoh, who had, by his presence, forced my mouth to kiss the ground. I did not know if the weight on my back still came from his eyes, the full heat of the sun, or both, and very much the same, since I had been told from the day I had heard the name, Son of the Sun, that no man on earth was nearer to Ra than our monarch, Si-Ra, Ramses IX, in all of his great titles, Nefer-Ka-Ra, Set Penere, Ramses, Kam-Usi Meriamun, for Ptah-nem-hotep, was only the name of his boyhood by which old friends and high officials could call him. Then I do not know whether I passed through vertigo or bliss, but circles of colors that vibrated right up from the earth into my eyes, and I felt another force summoning me to rise until I lifted my eyes high enough to look up to the balcony for the face of the pharaoh. He was seated between two columns, and leaned with his elbows upon a gold railing protected by a red embroidered cushion. I could see no more of his body than a collar of gold that covered his chest, and above was his great double crown, high and full as two sails, and with the small jeweled body of the gold snake above his right eye. It was more like looking at a large shield than at a man. The tall white crown of the pharaoh forming the upper arch, and his collar the lower, or so I might have thought but for his beautiful face between. He had eyes that were very large, and the black lines of the cosmetics made them more prominent. As my mother told me, his eyes were famous for change of color. Now bright and clear as the sky, they would yet reflect the dark of a moonless night. He had a long, sad nose, not at all like other noses. It was very thin. His nostrils were as narrow as a cat's. As he turned his head, I could see that the shape of his nose was curious, for the curve, by one view, gave to his elegant and aquiline AQUI line. All right, we'll look that one up. For those of you just joining us, feel free to skip ahead and then edit this part out if you don't like me reading the dictionary. But maybe it's your favorite part. It's mine. Does Q come before or after N? What do you think? Don't say the whole alphabet in your head. After? It's after. I did the whole alphabet in my head. Aphorism. Arch. App. Air. App. Aquarius. Aquabat. AQUI. What's the word? Aquiline. 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 Pertaining to or resembling an eagle. Curved like an eagle's beak. An aquiline nose. That's cool. I'm glad we did that. Should do that more often. His elegant and aquiline face, a fine scimitar. I'm not looking that word up. I think it's like a staff. SCIMITAR. But from the other side looked as mournful as a drop of water about to fall from a downturned leaf. Beneath that narrow nose was a beautiful mouth, full and splendidly curved, and it lived in intimacy with the nose above. A most peculiar way to describe it, except it made me think of my nurse, Aya Sayeb, standing next to me, since we did not look the least alike. And she was a slave, although I was never so comfortable as when I found myself with her, short, fat Ayaseb. As I looked at his mouth and nose, I could also see my nose against the thick skirt of Ayaseb's upper thigh, and recollected the smell of earth and fish and riverbank that came off of her, that seemed kin to the care with which Ptah-nem-hotep's narrow nostrils seemed to curl in the breath that came from his mouth. And I felt a strong desire to kiss him. I wished to bury my sweet mouth. Everyone assured me my mouth was sweet. On the lips of Ra. On the lips of the son of Ra. And this desire, having come to me, gave permission to the next desire. I saw myself straining at the tip of my toes to kiss the divine finger between the legs of the pharaoh. An impulse I could hardly take in before my next thought was to do the same to my great-grandfather. Can we leave this behind, please? There. I don't think you're going to leave this behind. This is this type of book. This is what it is. You could stop whenever you want. Thanks, man. There, beneath the spell of my pharaoh's nose, as bewitching to me as the powdered navel of my mother, I had a vision of myself in the future. And I was a young man in a dark room within a dark mountain, there on my knees before the ka of my great-grandfather. And I do not know if all I now saw at the age of 6 was only a gift given back to me from the ka of my self-remembering, at last a day of my life. Okay, wait, we gotta read that again. I do not know if all I now saw at the age of 6 was only a gift given back to me from the ka of myself remembering at last a day of my life, or whether I was not in truth on the patio. Okay, cool. On the patio of Ptah Hotep. He's unsure whether he is living in a memory or not. We know the truth that he is. Okay. On the patio of Ptah Hotep, for so I called him at once in my heart, as if we were old friends. And therefore I was more alive here than in my ka on its knees at the tomb of Khufu. Then, as I arose from a night of awful dreams into the day, I became certain I was alive and 6 years old, when, still kneeling with my arms before me, I looked up again to the face of the pharaoh. And he spoke in a clear and ringing voice of the most distinguished tones. Indeed a voice. I most certainly heard it. That phrase for phrase was equal to my great-grandfather at easing a truth with quiet mockery. Menenhedet, said the pharaoh, can it be a small motive that encourages you to honor my invitation? Matters of the greatest concern for myself would seem of small import to your majesty, said Menenhedet in a voice that floated forth like a leaf laid on water. You could not have a small reason, only a modest explanation, said our pharaoh, and pleased with this answer added, Rise, great Menenhedet, take your family and join me here. He patted the cushion beside him. An attendant led us to a painted stairway, and from there it was 10 steps to the balcony. Ptah embraced my great-grandfather and kissed my mother on the cheek. She bowed and kissed his toe, but demurely, like a cat. And my father, he was received solemnly, knelt and gave an embrace to the other toe. Please tell me the name of Hathfertiti's son, said Ptah Hotep. It is Menenhedet II, said Hathfertiti. Menenhet Ka, said the pharaoh. An ogre's name for a lovely face. He looked at me carefully and gave me an explanation. Only the beauty of Hathfertiti could give birth to so perfect a face. Do not stand unmoving, my son, said my father. Yes, said Ptah Hotep tenderly. You had better kiss my foot. So I knelt, and I saw that his toenails were painted blue, and his foot, when I kissed it, was perfumed, and, like my mother's scent, gave the odor of a dark red rose, or that I thought was the odor of his foot, until I realized the floor had been washed in perfume. Kissing the space between the big toe and the next, my nose was pinched for an instant. The pharaoh's toes were fingering me. Huh. And I felt a flash of pain, not pain so much as white light within my body. A light that must have come from the Pharaoh. Its intensity made me feel like a flower plucked up from the roots. Did a flower see the same white light? As if I lived again in more than one place at once. So did I know what it would be like to come forth into a woman, my flesh emblazoned in the white light of the God who came to meet me. Experiencing a lot of things here. Much stimulated by this power of living in two houses, my tongue began to lick the crotch of the Pharaoh's foot, and I came away with more than an odor of the rose. The faintest smell of earth and river and fish, all kin to the smell of Ayasayab's thighs, was also there, and even a remote hint of the fierce manly odor of urine that could often reek from the height above Menenhetit's knees. I even felt full of the same kind of bemusement I used to know in smelling my fingers after tickling a little saliva over my sweet finger or my hips and my navel. Living in the pocket of these odors, I felt the power once more of the Pharaoh's presence, and understood, as if never before instructed, that the Pharaoh was indeed the nearest of men to the gods. Yet I also knew he was a man who smelled a little like a woman, and his smells were near my own. I looked up, bowed my head, withdrew 2 steps upon my knees, and stood slowly. The Pharaoh did not take his eyes from me. "Your boy is extraordinary," he said to Hathfertiti, "and has a sweet mouth." Oh, come on, man. He will yet prove a scandal with his tongue. Dude. Turning his look from myself to my great-grandfather in a movement just so full of the gravity of his mind as the change in mood of the sky when the sun is covered slowly by a cloud, he said to Menenhetit, "You will do well to increase every strength in this boy that sits below his mouth." "That may be the search of all men," said my great-grandfather. "For pharaohs as well," said Ptah-nem-hotep. My great-grandfather responded with a most unexpected speech. "O you who live in the night, yet shine upon us in the day, who are wise as the earth and as the river, you of the 2 great houses, intimate of Set and Horus, you who speak to the living and the dead, ask of your servant Menenhetit any small question he can attempt to answer, but do not ask him to ponder whether a pharaoh has need of strength in those mysterious regions that lie above the thigh and beneath the navel." What? I gotta go pull something out the oven. I thought I was closer. Just hang out. I'll pause it, sure. I don't know how far we're gonna get with this one. These chapters are getting long. But so far, let's recap real quick. They made it to the Pharaoh. It's pretty. The first courtyard was filled with people practicing chariot maneuvers. They were called geldins or something. Splendors, Sherdans. The Hathfertiti's like totally not into it. She's like, "Dude, get these losers out of here." And then they keep walking, and then they walk into a courtyard, just balconies around them. I couldn't really tell what was going on. I'm in there, and the Pharaoh's on a balcony above them. They go up, and after imagining blowing him, they're just kissing his little sweet finger. They go up, and they all make out with his feet. You know, like you do. The Pharaoh's like, "Man, this 6-year-old kid Sure is good at kissing feet. And then it sounds like the Pharaoh's trying to convince the great-grandfather to make the son a good lover or something. Or maybe a good fighter, I can't tell. I kind of look like shit. You could use a little maintenance. Oh well. He said all this. How much more do I have to read? I don't think it's going to happen, buddy. You have to read everything. It's all right. Just read a little more. He said all this with such an absence of fear and such cold prowess that he separated himself from the pious sounds of his praise. He had shown me once how a captured officer might hand over a sword while feeling contempt for the general to whom he surrendered. It was the only time he ever played such a game with me. And I was wondering if he showed contempt for the Pharaoh now by the words of his speech. Tell me, lovely Hathfertiti, said our Ramses IX, does he speak of me in this fashion when I am not with you? He lives, said my mother, for word of your smile and mention of your approval. So let's take a minute and remember that when I started reading this book, I think that he is, he's totally unaware that he is Menenhedet II's Ka, right? And he is having a memory of Menenhedet II as a separate entity, although he is just part of him, as a sacrilegious person that spoke ill of the Pharaoh. And perhaps it will be because of this story. It shouldn't ruin everything. He lives, said my mother, for word of your smile and mention of your approval. Tell me, great general, said the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh went on, with only a shrug of his fine shoulders for Hathfertiti's reply, which had been too quick. Is this the manner in which you once spoke to my great ancestor? Menenhedet bows. It was a young voice then. I have an old one now. Besides, the ancestor was a great pharaoh, Ptah-nem-hotep said. The difference, Menenhedet said, between Ramses II and Ramses IX is as the difference between great gods. Of which great gods do you speak? If I dare name them, I give you permission. Ramses II was called Horus, the strong bull who loves the truth. Yet he would remind me more of the great god Set. Menenhedet took a pause, for the effect of such boldness to be appreciated, and added, even as you, great ninth of the Ramses, encouraged me to invoke the presence of he who is without compare, and is Osiris. Menenhedet had made a splendid remark. Ptah-nem-hotep gave a rich laugh, almost as rich as in the sounds of its pleasure as the amusement I would sometimes hear in my mother's voice, and I wondered then if Ptah-nem-hotep would also groan with the same profundity of expression as Hathfertiti. They usually speak of Ptah, not Osiris, he said. Ptah, P-T-A-H, I don't remember. I am most delighted that you are here. At an inclination of his head, servants brought cushions, and he beckoned for us to sit beside him, even sharing the space on his own large cushion with my grandfather, who indeed was embraced and kissed begrudgingly on the mouth as soon as he sat down, after which Ptah-nem-hotep all but inquired of the taste left on his lips by a turn of tongue to the corner of his beautiful mouth. The Pharaoh, now inclining himself to Hathfertiti, said, While the servants anoint us, I will go on with this day's work. I have audiences yet to give, but must tell you that they can prove tedious. Would you prefer to be taken to your rooms? I would like to listen as the problems of the two kingdoms are presented to your wisdom. I'm assuming Menenhedet says that. It will be a pleasure to have you at my side, he whispered to her, now Hathfertiti, of course. And my father immediately gave a signal. A few servants came up with alabaster bowls of scented water that they set at the feet of Ptah-nem-hotep, Menenhedet, my mother, and myself. It was then that the Pharaoh indicated a fifth cushion for my father. You need not oversee the eunuchs. Nephkep Ochem, the Pharaoh told him. Nephkep Ochem. My father had a spark in his eye at this mention of himself. It suggested he was not always given such a gift as to hear his full name. Good and great God, he replied, I breathe the spirit of your divine kindness. But I cannot rest upon my cushion for fear the eunuchs will commit an unpardonable error. Okay, so while my father did not explain much of himself to me, once, unforgettably, I was told how his work as an overseer of the cosmetic box and pencil could on occasion be as important at the post of the visor as the post of the vizier. For whenever times of trouble came to the two lands, then the bearing of the Pharaoh, that is to say, his body, his clothing he wore, and the cosmetics put upon his face, was vital to the good fortune of Egypt. Any gesture that the Pharaoh might make on such a day could shift the course of battles in distant places. The perfection of his eyes, painted pale green and black, could give magnitude to each inclination of his head. When the Pharaoh was seated on his throne, which always faced the river, he had only to incline the royal neck right or left, and a breeze would begin on the upper or lower kingdom. So did he need no more than to turn the handle of his crook, and benedictions could be sent to shepherds in valleys we did not see, even as the smallest shake of his flail would inspire the field overseers to whip their labor gangs. His sunshade, made from an ostrich tail, promoted the health of flowers. The great necklace that covered his chest was the golden ear of the sun, and his crown of feathers, when he chose to wear it, gave joy or solemnity to the song of birds. My mother had frowned as my father instructed me in these stories. Why don't you tell the boy that it is only the ancient kings who could put on a leopard's tail and stir the animals in the jungle? Our Ptah Nemhotep does not possess such powers. But even as a child, I could see that my father, despite his desire for perfect decorum, was most practical. The Pharaoh, he answered, would have infinite power if he were not constantly attacked by other powers who are also infinite. Why, she asked, is he attacked? Because of the weakness of the pharaohs who came before him. He looked back at me. For this reason, it is more important than ever that any ornament which touches his body be without flaw, or his power is weakened further. I thought there had to be some error in my father's argument. Certainly he was not always to be found at the presence of the Pharaoh. He was often at home, so he could hardly oversee every last cosmetic. So his dad puts on the makeup of the Pharaoh? Did I already know that? Wondering about this, I saw that my father now stood to the side and did not really interfere with the work of the eunuchs who had come in with all the friendliness of puppies and all the grace of dancing girls, while two of them began, humming little tunes and smiling at us, to wash Ptah Nemhotep's feet with great playfulness, as if indeed like puppies, they had something of a right to nip and knot his ankles. 3 others served Menedhett, my mother, myself. With a considerable amount of merriment, their teeth shining, they tickled the soles of our feet and wiggled their fingers like minnows between our toes, only to scourge the dead skin from our heels with their blunt fingernails. Ew! After a while, they finished with our feet and began to massage our legs. They were handsome men, probably had been chosen from the same village in Nubia or Kush, for they were all about the same size, and of the same deep black, and their resemblance to one another was increased by the shining ivory pin that passed through their nose, each pin set at the same angle from their mouth, as if they had all been born with one decoration from one womb. They knew their work, and with or without my father would hardly make an error. Soon they were massaging not only our legs, but our necks and shoulders. And the eunuch serving Hathfertiti began to rub an oil in exquisite circles around her navel, to which she gave unabashed grunts of pleasure. Curiously clear and loud, as if such a forceful sound was certainly part of a noble woman's etiquette. I must purchase this eunuch from you, she said to Ptah Nemhotep, who smiled agreeably. Are they not delightful? He asked, and looked at the dark bodies of these 5 slaves with the same love I had seen my great-grandfather give to a team of matched horses or twin white bulls. And indeed, since the slaves were nothing, one could see not only their plump and muscular haunches, but the shiny stump where their testicles had been, and this gave them a nice resemblance to geldings. All right, we're going to look up a couple things. Let's look up the word gelding. A, B, C, D, E, G, E, wait, G, E, L, D. Geldings, a castrated male animal. Does ESP mean especially? Especially a horse. To geld. To castrate. To geld a stallion, deprived of something essential. To be gelded of one's pride. Wow, I didn't know that. Let's look up another word and take a break. I like just to look, open it, see a word you don't know, and see what it is. Eye cup. It's one word. Eye cup. EYECUP. A device for applying eye wash to the eye, consisting of a cup or glass with a rim shaped to fit snugly around the orbit of the eye. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Just need to take a break. Eat some food real quick. I'll return and finish this today, though. I put this book off for a minute. It's kind of gross. This book is real gross. I luckily can separate myself from the imagery here pretty well. I don't know how well other people are doing.